Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
Extraterrestrials Part 7 Note. This section generally deals with the existence of various extraterrestrial civilizations, their histories, societies, cultures, behaviors, technologies, etc. An excellent summary of the UFO, extraterrestrial phenomenon, is given by Billy Meier in his article Extraterrestrials, found in Contact Report 257. Drawings and photorealistic renditions of some extraterrestrials may be seen at the end of Contact Reports 830 and 836. A list of extraterrestrials who have contacted Billy Meier can be found at the FIGU website. Contact Report 653.
You promised me during your last visit to our private meeting that you would do some research in your annals in order to be able to give me more precise information on my questions regarding the fact that you Plejaran have been living in peace for more than 50,000 years. That is to say, without wars and revolutions and terrorism, etc., and also in a truly direct democracy. I am also interested in how it was before, with regard to the forms of government and the administrations of your countries, and how did your united world, or the community of nations on Era, come about? As you know, on Earth we have various state governments up to dictatorships, as well as lower administrations subordinate to the state governments, as is the case, for example, in Switzerland, where the Federal Council, the National Council, and the Council of States form the supreme government. Then in the cantonal governments, as well as district and municipal administrations and so on. Did you Plejaran have similar conditions in earlier times, or what was it like? But now I have another question. Whether you Plejaran previously had similar forms of government to those that exist today on Earth?
That was in fact the case, as the ancient records regarding a peaceful global world leadership among several Plejaran folks were not heeded, for which reason insurrections, wars, revolutions, and diverse forms of terrorism occurred. But that resulted from the fact that 5 different folks distantly descended from the Nacodemian lineage had settled on Era, who were rivals to each other, about which, however, I should give a few significant explanations for your information. Of course, I cannot be too detailed with those, but will only discuss the most important information, because the whole history is so extensive that a day-long lecture would be required to discuss it all. Hence, I shall begin. Our folk, from which I myself am distantly descended, bore since time immemorial the designation Nokdemisdarn, which means, in the language of our ancestors, in brief, folk of Nocodemion. This folk comprised 11 folks, which had their homeworld on a planet called Erana, in a star system called Izdkura. When the astronomers realized that a destructive change was happening in the star system Izdkura, in which our ancestors lived, and that an annihilation of the whole system was imminent, and the destruction was spreading rapidly, through which the home planet Erana was also threatened with destruction, a resettlement possibility in another star system on another planet was sought for all the folks. Such a star system was in fact found after a few years, so all 11 folks, who in total comprised 510 million human beings, were resettled in the new system within 28 years, namely on 2 different planets in 2 different solar systems. The cosmic destruction process of the Izdkura star system lasted 213 years before the whole system was entirely wiped out. The resettlement in the new star system, which was about 6 light-years across, happened about 26 million years ago, and since then till the present time we have been based in the Plejaran system, which will also remain so. The resettlement occurred into two different solar systems on two life-bearing able planets in a large star system, that is to say, a so-called open, loose star cluster. Already at the beginning of the colonization in the new star system, it was called Pleiaren by our Ur ancestors, namely an alteration of the name Plejara after the Jeshrishish presiding over the resettlement. Our Ur ancestors chose this star system designation according to an old, passed-down tradition that stated that the first folk that colonized a formerly uninhabited but now habitable planet in a new star system should take for the name of the star system the name of the Ishwish Resp, Shwish, or of the Ishrish, or Shush, in charge of the action. Borrowing from the home planet Irana, the new home planet was then named in abbreviated form Era. This on the one hand. On the other hand, the new planet Era was colonized by the first 6 folks that had been following the teaching of the prophets since time immemorial and were therefore peaceful, democratic, and heedful and following of the creational laws and recommendations. From this lineage descended all the clans of my genealogy, who have undertaken since time immemorial to follow and spread the teaching of the prophets, namely the teaching that had its origin with the universal prophet Nocedemion. The ancient undertaking traced back to then, because, as our annals state, the most distant Ur ancestors of my own lineage issue from the universal prophet Nocedemion. The mission on Earth is also in this succession of undertaking, which has lasted up to this day, and in which also our early as well as our direct forebears were involved in recent millennia. So, the home planet of the emigrants from the star system Idskura had been destroyed by a cosmic catastrophe, for which reason the humankind existing there had to leave and seek out a new home, which they found in the new star system, which was known to them and was located more than 4,000 light-years away, which after the colonization they named Pleiaren, and which contained, in the 6 light-year encompassing system space, about 563 system members. In this Pleiaren system there existed solar systems with planets, among which 2 were capable of bearing human and other diverse forms of life. Consequently, these worlds were considered for colonization by the settlers, so the first 6 folks, to which my Ur ancestors also belonged, who formed a knowledgely and teaching successive community, colonized the planet that was called Era. The other 5 folks were entitled a planet in a neighboring solar system that was given the name Eras. This planet, too, was naturally a planet capable of bearing life for human beings and for other life forms, so the settlers remained there from then on. Everything went well for all the following millions of years, as the population of all folks was maintained, in accordance with the prescribed law, at a size of a little more than 500 million in total, as had been laid down in law since time immemorial in order that no overpopulation could occur, and so that no unsolvable problems and no destructions to nature or to the planet be elicited. But then it came to pass a little less than 112,300 years BC by terrestrial Emmanuel-based reckoning, that a might-obsessed Ishwish and an Ishrish from 2 of the folks joined forces in an Ausartung corresponding wise, who united their 2 folks and brought about a Gewalt rule by means of minions drilled in acts of Gewalt, and were able to enforce this against all resistance. The conjoined populations were terrorized and tormented, as all the ancient traditional laws, recommendations, regulations, and manners were replaced by Ausartung corresponding new decrees, and the 2 might-obsessed ones were placed in the position of a higher might. The process lasted more than 200 years and disabled the population in regard to their own powers of decision-making as well as in their intellect and rationality. and this occurred in a form whereby the two might possessors were obligatorily treated as absolute dictators, which quickly led to compulsory submissiveness and servitude of the population, as well as ultimately to the delusional belief that the dictators be in possession of the almightiness and the creation power. The inevitable consequence thereof led quickly and inevitably to worship of the dictators, and so to a state of belief of a religious form, because the human beings had submissively distanced themselves far from the reality through the Gewalt rulership and imagined themselves, contrary to intellect and rationality, to be free, protected, and independent, so long as they humbly, prayingly, and undissentingly submitted to the Gewalt rulership. Hence, in a religious wise, real flesh and blood might-obsessed human beings were worshipped as creational omnipotences, unlike the imaginary unreal deities, as the wonder-working creator beings in our fairy tale forms were called. In doing so, they unlearned that they owed their entire existence ultimately to their own achievement, and not to the dictators. Ultimately, the human beings came to believe, in their centuries-long Gewalt and compulsionally suggestively indoctrinated delusion, that the Gewalt rulers and their later successors of the same kind had in primeval times originally created them as human beings, and had also created the air to breathe, the water to drink, and even the sun, all the heavenly bodies, the planets, and all life forms. For all the human beings, the Gewalt and coercion-based delusional belief became an axiomatic, that is to say, incontrovertible, unquestionable fact, so that all these things should have been provided to them since time immemorial by the Gewalt rulers, who they believed to be creationally superior to them, and that they were obliged to worship these dictators servilely, thank them for their benevolence, and in their presence to lower the gaze and cover the head. Thereby, the belief came to be, and so the fact of religion, that in having been created by the Gewalt rulers, that is to say dictators, the human beings have a connection back to these, thus exactly what is said by the term religion, binding back religar. This term relates, in the form of an irrational teaching, to the situation of the religion believers having supposedly relinquished a connection to their dictators, that is to say creators, namely the belonging together with them, wherefrom there then be the obligation for them, the human beings, that is to say religion believers, to reconnect with them. It bears saying furthermore that through the combination of these two folks and the delusional belief in the Gewalt rulers, that is to say dictators, as well as through their might machinations and acts of Gewalt, also unpeace arose with the other three folks. From this circumstance there resulted terrible and destructive wars between all the folks and, 75,140 years ago, triggered a planetary catastrophe, which ultimately spread over the whole planet Eris, and took on global and devastating proportions, namely in that the planet and its atmosphere began to die off and slowly but constantly made all life impossible. Hence, a mass exodus of the hostility-embroiled and embattled folks took place, and the nearest solution for them was to approach the planet Era as their nearest place of refuge, and there to set down their craft with Gewalt. The anciently indigenous six folks on Era additionally wanted to become involved in no belligerent actions, so they, albeit reluctantly, permitted the Gewalt and invasionly immigration of the refugees and, naturally, refrained from their hostile entanglements, but did, however, endeavor in the name of the folk through the spirit leadership to put an end, through peace efforts, to the repeatedly igniting Gewalt and war actions among the Gewalt-Lai immigrated folks, which, however, was completely without success. The population count of the Gewalt-doing immigrants consisted of 382 million human beings, thus all of those who had survived the war actions on Eris. Thus, The population count on Era rose to about 900 million, which naturally led to many problems and difficulties, which the anciently settled folks had to deal with, who naturally, in accordance with their laws, recommendations, rules and regulations, etc., were helpful to the folks of their neighbor system. They, however, did not conform to the laws and recommendations, etc., of the anciently indigenous folks, but continued their feuds and wars amongst themselves and against each other. And this continued for following centuries, yet the anciently indigenous six folks abstained and did not interfere, which was respected by the intruders. This respect resulted from the fact that they knew full well that the anciently indigenous inhabitants of Era were ready, in the event of an attack upon them, to defend themselves, and moreover were greatly superior to the would-be attackers in every respect. For that matter, it further bears saying, of the 11 folks of that time, thus only 6 of them were peaceful, democratic, and, in regard to their way of life, aligned with the teaching of the prophet, which already since very early times had determined in every respect within these folks their life, their deeds, actions, and behaviors, and comprehensively likewise everything else about them. In the course of time, these 6 folks formed themselves on our planet Era together into a single folk, and this folk vested supreme authority in a 9-person spirit leadership, which had the office of conducting the affairs of the folk according to the democratically charactered folk will, which has unfailingly remained the case to this day and also will remain so indefinitely. The other 5 folks practiced, as I previously explained, religious and higher human power-oriented belief forms. So for the sake of Gavalt rulers, that is to say dictators, whom they worshipped in a religious wise as their creators, which, for our great folk, was naturally irreconcilable with the reality, and thus also did not correspond to the real truth. All of these 5 diverse higher power-believing folks were mutually unpeaceful and even hostile to one another, as similarly the populations were peaceless and loveless as well as aggressive amongst themselves. Hence, also after their exodus from the unlivable home planet Eris, they continued as before repeatedly to carry out hostile actions against each other and disturb the peace on Era, until ultimately, 74,200 years ago, a global war took place in all those regions inhabited by the war-obsessed folks who were engaged in their mutual hostility toward our great folk. However, they respected our efforts for peace, and so kept at rest toward us and abstained from offensive actions against us. Yet this was also no doubt ensured by our much higher technology in regard to defensive actions, for ours were very superior to theirs. Insurrections, wars, revolutions, and terrorism were inevitable among these folks of beliefly dictators because of the systems of government in operation over them, which were operated by the might-obsessed rulers. These ruled the folks in a gruesome wise, similar to how has been done on Earth since time immemorial and as continues to be done, for this has been perpetuated into the present time. The whole of the undemocratic systems were, on the one hand, practiced in the form of monarchies, dictatorships, and other Gevalt rulerships, as well as, however, through similar forms as are called republics, etc., in the terrestrial sense. Not until a final 7-year, extremely terrible and devastating global war, about 4,200 years ago, by the mutually hostile folks that had fled from Eris to Era, did it come about at last, after more than half of the human population of these hostility-embroiled folks was reduced through the war actions, that the Erisans' minds changed for the better. A political upheaval and transformation process was then sought with many ideas, which lasted around 14,000 years and did not bring any success, but always remained present and was taken up again from time to time. The remaining war folks of Eris engaged in rationality-wanting quarrels, were at odds with each other and brought forward some objections and proposals that could not be implemented, so everything came to naught. They frequently imagined themselves to be disadvantaged, wanted special conditions, more might and rights, so time and again the whole matter fell through and the old forms of government were continued and validated. That led again and again to insurrections, actions of war, to revolutions and terrorism. Not until the individual spirit leaders of these quarreling, warlike folks confederated into a spirit leadership and unitarily gave teachings to the war folks, were the Arasans stimulated to concern themselves deeply rationally in the framework of the ancient traditional teaching of the ancient prophet and to learn it comprehensively. But the efforts for that fundamentally came from the spirit leadership of the anciently indigenous folks, who intended to debut a whole planetary leadership if the warlike folks could assent to it. Yet the teachings giving and teaching lasted a further about 3,000 years, before the teaching was sufficiently accepted by and integrated into the thought world of all the quarreling folks that had fled to Era and had incessantly sowed discord there, that the human beings began to cultivate a better attitude in themselves and toward the relations with the population of their own countries, as well as the population of other countries. Nonetheless, time and again there still arose aggressions and ausartungs in regard to insurrections, acts of war and terrorism, and in general the responsible motives for these were religious and related to the various extant belief communities still believing in the Gavalt rulers and dictators. Eventually there came at last the point in time when, in cooperation with the indigenous spirit leadership, the spirit leadership of the hostile folks had also worked out a new form of state leadership, which was approved by all folks, according to the system of the old teaching of the prophet. Having at last grown weary of the insurrections, wars, revolutions, and terrorism, the countless dead and the destructions, ultimately, of the about 382 million human beings of the Gevalt-employingly immigrated hostile and embattled folks, more than half were killed by the global war, namely more than 217 million, and so there were only 165 million survivors. This ultimately led to the situation that the rest of the hostile folks were actually willing to heed the drawn-up rules and proposals of the spirit leadership and to approve these. That did occur only with great effort, but such that rapid progress was made, and the human beings who had been devotees of the higher powers disengaged themselves from their delusional belief, broke free thereof and assimilated into the democracy of the indigenous Arans, and also unanimously into the rules and laws of the planetary spirit leaders, who had been appointed by the great folk as the supreme planetary spirit leadership. Yet there was also likewise a spirit leadership responsible for each country, that is to say, state. Thus, for the entire planet and also for all the previously hostile, now however semi-peaceful countries, that is to say states, the planetary unanimous leadership form of the spirit leadership could be implemented. Consequently, all extant formerly hostile and Gawalt-usingly immigrated folks of all countries were, in the course of the following 5,000 years, further given teachings by the spirit leadership in accordance with the teaching of the prophet, and led into a peaceful future. And since, through the Gawaltly migration of the formerly warlike folks from the planet Eros, the population of Era increased by 382 million human beings, of which ultimately only about 165 million remained following their global war, and therefore the prescribed norm of few more than 500 million human beings had been greatly exceeded. Naturally, the population of Era surpassed the established quantity. They were naturally integrated into the whole Aran population. So the prescribed norm of 500 million was exceeded, and this no longer accorded with the standard per the relevant law, So population regulation measures were taken in order to reach the correct population size. So, through the planetary spirit leadership, a guiding and for the Aaron total population, unanimously valid behavior directive was drawn up regarding a strict birth regulation and explainingly promulgated to the population of Era in all connected relations and concerns and put to a vote. And as is recorded in our annals, the whole population of Era assented to the directive without a single dissenting vote. So it was implemented, and the goal of reduction of the population to the prescribed standard was achieved through an appropriate yet strict birth control within 301 years of terrestrial time reckoning. From that point on, the size of the Aaron humanity remained constant, for, as the immemorially prescribed norm pertaining to progeny has been, owing to intellect and rationality of the Aaron population, upheld for the sake of their own and their world's well-being, as well as for that of the nature, fauna, and flora, the planet and its requirements. There are no destructive problems in this regard. Lastly, it is to be said that during the subsequent 5,000 years, that is before the definitive peace could be created, it also happened, and without gay vault or coercion, rather only through the once hostile Erasons, evermore following the teaching of the prophet and beginning to think, act, and live according to it, that resultingly all of their religious issues became resolved and eventually there existed no more religion believers on Era. That was then the definitive cause for our world being permanently pacified and democratized, and since then no insurrections, wars, no revolutions, and no terrorism have occurred anymore. So on our planet Era, about 52,000 years ago, among all folks unanimously the true democracy, and so also a henceforth lasting peace were created, and with that also an ample freedom for all human beings on Era. Thereby, it came to pass that all ideas and belief forms pertaining to undemocratic forms of government and behaviors, of the earlier ruler and might government forms on the planet Eras, were forbidden by the formerly hostilely delusional believers of Eras themselves among their kind and replaced by new laws and regulations, etc., of the spirit leadership, and these were accepted and approved by the extant remaining total population of Erasons in a democratic wise. So everything was regulated in every respect, and this has upheld up to the present day, and shall also remain so for all the future. The consciousness development of the Aaron population, which is to be assessed at between 20 and 30 million years higher than that of the terrestrial human beings, does not enable for us Pleiaren any relapses into dark, de-evolutive and inhuman machinations, because the entire Pleiaren population has once and for all progressed onto the way of the teaching of the prophets and shall also, with sureness, tread that way further.
Contact Report 654.
So now I come to the next question, which refers to one of the 4 groups or groupings, of which there are actually 5, whereby in this relation there is a double grouping, but which you both call the same, namely future Earth. This may be a little confusing, but it is acceptable and does not refer to my question, because it is aimed at whether you are allowed to tell me openly whether you now know where this 4th group from outside Earth comes from.
We know that by now, but
I thought to myself, then not officially, was just a question. Furthermore, I think it has now become clear to me why you have always talked about grouping on the one hand, or about grouping on the other, because if I have understood correctly, then you understand group to mean a closed community, and in a grouping several groups of the same or different kind, don't you? In that case, I have misunderstood you for years.
you obviously did because what you are saying is true. The term group is to be understood as a smaller or larger number of members coming together or belonging together, whereby these people form an ordered unit or a community, A circle of people who belong together on the basis of certain similarities because they have joined together on the basis of common interests and goals, as is the case with the Phi-Gu core group. On the other hand, a grouping forms a closed combination of several groups of the same character. For example, the Phi-Gu core parent group and the Phi-Gu passive group, study groups and interest groups. Thus, in this sense, a grouping comprises several like-minded groups. On the other hand, however, a grouping can also include a number of groups which are of completely different nature and interests, and are therefore not a closed unit, but which in themselves form an autonomous and independent whole, although these groups as a whole have one thing in common.
Interesting, but annoying for me, because all these years I have misunderstood your, and generally your Pleiaren interpretation of group and grouping, and I did not ask Lachkov for an explanation earlier. But now it is clear to me what is meant by group and grouping. So if I have understood correctly, you are also talking about several groups in relation to the other groupings that you keep mentioning. So I was thoroughly mistaken that there were only 4 groups, because in reality there must be several of them. But then there are the grouping of the Earth foreigners and the 2 other groupings that are based on earthly things. Is it permissible to speak openly about this?
What you say is correct, but we can only talk about it in a private way. You know.
Yes, I understand, because although I misunderstood you for years, I did not exactly fall on my head and know that you have to talk about your directives again. But if I repeat, then you have spoken of one group or of 4 specific groups on the one hand. Therefore, the speech was of a single group or of 4 groups from a specific grouping, as for example of the grouping Future Earth, which consists of 2 groups. And according to what I now know, the other groupings must comprise more than just 2 groups, perhaps 3, 4, 5, or more.
Yes, that is how it is.
Contact Report 675.
But something else that refers to you, Pleiaren, because as you have explained to me, the majority of the population works only 2 hours or so per day according to our time, while the other time is used in a private way. You have told me that in your free time the Pleiaren work and maintain their large private gardens, which cover at least 1 hectare or 1,000 natr mies. Others fly with their aircraft over land or around the planet, and land where other people work to do private work together. And all this happens without any financial compensation, because you have no financial economy anymore. But even if you are only about 530 million people on Era, there is quite a lot of work to be done to feed the whole population and to satisfy all their other needs. I will ask you how you manage this so that everything can be created when the majority of your humanity works only 2 hours a day for the general public. Is there no problem with that?
The whole thing would be impossible if we did not have our very sophisticated, extensive, and diverse technology at our disposal. Basically, of course, our planetary population also has to do a lot of work, which has to be carried out, but which is largely carried out by our highly developed technology. The main of all activities is carried out by elaborate androids, apparatuses, and machinery, which are monitored and controlled by the majority of the working population during the 2 hours of work. And these are effectively only surveillance and control works to be carried out by the majority of the Era population, according to times in day and night divisions, to which you once said around the clock in another context.
The majority of the population, what does that mean?
It must be understood to mean all persons at any age from 140 years of age, which is to be understood according to earthly years, and this is maintained until old age, because every person in our society is involved throughout his or her life either for the general public or in a purely private way. Our 530 million or so humanity is to be understood in terms of the people who carry out their work, which, however, do not include descendants up to 140 years of age, who also include a number of about 110 million.
You mean 110 million? So there is no rotting in any way of the physical and thought-feel-psychological, as is very often the case with us on Earth, after people retire and then know nothing more to do with themselves. But I didn't know that you wouldn't count the 110 million descendants, who are up to 140 years old, among the approximately 530 million of the working people. But I think that this has to be added up because your planet Era is about the same size as Earth, but has more mainland, as you once explained.
We Pleioran measure in this respect the possible population according to the fertile land that, when cultivated for food products, produces abundant food for the total population. As a result, no part of the population can ever be affected by famine, as is the case on Earth, where around 1 billion people are currently suffering from hunger and many die from it. And as far as such behavior, which you call rotting, is concerned, Pleioran is alien to us, even if a person wants to withdraw from general work and only be active privately, which is of course possible, but must be guaranteed. However, this is usually only possible at the age of 800, although very little use is usually made of it.
Then it must also be the case that these people still have their entire livelihood when they retire from general work at the age of 800. How's that settled?
They are fully granted everything necessary in every respect and for every need until the end of their lives. So they do not have to renounce anything in any way, but receive everything according to their desires, be it food or any things of any kind that they desire.
So there are no people among you who are, as they say, poor or rich, if I understand your social system correctly, which is also due to the fact that you no longer have any means of payment or money.
This is indeed the case, because since we have no system whatsoever with regard to a monetary or financial economy, but an equal structure of equality, on the one hand with regard to social status and on the other with regard to the values of goods, there are no social and no social differences.
And this also not between the simple people, the spiritual leadership, and all those who have to carry out higher tasks than the normal daily general work.
There are no differences whatsoever. And there must be no differences because the equal status of the entire Era population means that neither greed nor envy nor other negative factors, which could be caused by material causes, prevail. Every Pleiorean person has equal rights, including the right to meet all his material needs within the same framework as any other. Thus, all manufactured goods of any kind are available to any person free of charge, as are all other goods.
And the rest of the majority of the population, what about it in terms of work and old age? How many percentages does this rest comprise, and what does it do?
According to our calculations, the majority of the entire player population comprises 72%, which is active in the way I have just explained, while the other 28% is responsible for other tasks, in which, calculated according to earthly hours, the working hours vary per day depending on the activity, but which are higher than 2 hours and are often 12, 15, or more. This is the case, for example, with the exercise of tasks related to spiritual leadership, planetary control tasks, and various other important matters.
Contact Report 679.
Today I once again have some questions concerning the peoples of Era and their behavior in relation to various things such as work, state of consciousness, ethics, criminality and crime, etc., as well as the offspring of you Pleioran. It would be good if you would explain how it is with you on Era, with the duty to work and with the responsibility for it. The other day you said that you have a total adult population of around 530 million and around 110 million offspring under the age of 140.
As I explained in an earlier conversation, the peoples on Era remain among themselves, and only very few persons emigrate to other peoples, whereby the reason for this is usually living together with other members of the peoples, or if there is some unavoidable need to do so. Otherwise, the individual peoples remain among themselves and preserve their own folk customs and traditions, etc. With this, I also explain that there are no migrations of peoples on Era, but also no refugees for any reason, because there are no uprisings or even wars on Era, etc. Consequently, there are also no reasons for a flight from one people to another. There is also no hunger among the peoples of Era, for since we Pleiaren adhere to the planetary requirements for the preservation of all life, so in relation to Pleiarenian humanity, nature and all its fauna and flora on the land, in the waters and in the air, the entire natural food cultivation and the further food production for the entire Era humanity can be produced in abundance without any problems. As far as unemployment is concerned, which you mention, we Pleiaren do not have it, because all Pleiaren of both sexes are comprehensively integrated into our planet-wide system of labor regulation. So there are also no work-shy persons on Era who would exhibit parasitic behavior, as is often the case with Earth humans. Also, with regard to criminality and crime, there are none among the human beings of Era, for the evolutionary stage of consciousness and ethics, and their stability of value, as well as the resulting sense of duty and responsibility, are so highly developed in every Pleiaren human being that negative deviations no longer appear. According to our birth regulation, it is to be explained that it is regulated on the one hand according to our high life expectancy, and on the other hand according to the number of the population, from which it results that consequently, on Era, the descendants are also to be determined according to the deaths, as however also according to various other necessary regulations, which can only be made when a humanity has reached a necessary high level of consciousness, as is the case with our Pleiaren peoples. This is in contrast to us Pleiaren, who are entitled to beget offspring at the age of 70 at the earliest, after which it can then take several hundred years until the next offspring is begotten, perhaps 200 or 300 years, if at all, for the rule is, which is privately observed as an unwritten law, that offspring are first begotten only at the age after 150 years. And this is so because all members of the population, without exception, learn several other fields of activity beyond the normal learning activity, which lasts until the age of about 70. Only then are all the main activity trainings completed, after which one enters into full and all-round active life. And since with us Pleiaren each marital alliance or other cohabitation may only produce 3 offspring, the fixed number of adults of about 530 million and of 110 million offspring under 140 years of age can be maintained by the regulation of our birth control. The total Pleiaren population of the world is regulated in such a way that it always remains approximately the same, which nevertheless means that the number of offspring can fall or rise by a few million, so that the number of around 110 million is not always exactly constant. On the one hand, offspring may only be begotten on request, but on the other hand, it can also occur that, as a result of various natural circumstances or necessities, more or fewer procreations are permitted. So when I gave the figure of about 530 million adults and 110 million errands under 140 years of age, these figures correspond to the present time.
Your birth rate could not be introduced on Earth, I think. And the question, with regard to the peoples, are there no problems there with regard to the birth control that has been ordered?
No, there are no problems. Because among our Pleiaren peoples, logical reason and logical reasoning are factors and values acquired thousands of years ago, which have become such a matter of course and for the benefit of the entire Iranian population that not even a suggestion of breaking the rule appears.
What you have now said with regard to the learning of diverse and varied activities, which we call vocational training here, you once told me that often 20 to 30 or even more fields of activity are learned, which are also practiced alternately throughout your lifetime. But something else. As you once told me, on Era you also radiate catastrophic events from alien planets worldwide, as well as in relation to natural disasters and overpopulation, which perhaps also contributes to the fact that, from the Era population, purely psychologically, there is a satisfaction and recognition in relation to the whole Aran forms of order. In addition, I think that Pleiaren humanity is oriented towards this, and accordingly also works to ensure that everything on Era remains in good order in every way. For my part, I think that such emanations can have a good psychological effect, because there is no indifference among your humanity, as is unfortunately the case with the majority of Earthlings.
And with regard to the entire Iranian world population, it is made aware again and again of the disasters and calamities that occur through overpopulation. So, planet-wide, information broadcasts are repeatedly broadcast, through which catastrophic conditions of uprisings, torture, war, murder, revolutions, terror, strife, misery, and distress, hunger, diseases, epidemics, and terror, etc. on overpopulation worlds are pointed out. The reason, however, is not that of deterrence, but purely informative, to show what generally unpeaceful and barbarous conditions still prevail on those worlds which in every respect are still millions of years behind our entire Pleiaren high development. The whole thing also has an instructive character in regard to the very early past of our primitive peoples, which occurred in the same or a similar framework, as is also still the case today in a very lasting way on other and still extremely uncivilized worlds and among their peoples, as is also the case with regard to the earthly world population.
Contact Report 688.
What will happen, however, when the Earth foreigners, who have been moving in Earth space for a long time, or others who will sooner or later appear, which will also only be a question of time, is still open and will be an event that will certainly cause many problems for all Earth humans. It must also be clear that Earth foreigners or Earth future beings do not have to be the same kind as us human beings, because various Earth foreigners are beings who are not human and also not peaceful.
Contact Report 697.
How do you Pleiaren create interpersonal relationships, and how do you make contacts for friendships and alliances?
In a very natural way, by holding events and making acquaintances, as well as through meetings of all kinds, such as getting to know other persons through acquaintances, neighbors, family members, and friends, through traveling around, doing work, as well as through all kinds of other ways.
So roughly on the same scale as we do on Earth?
No, because the same thing that is practiced on Earth through so-called internet acquaintances does not exist here, just as it does not exist in the way that public bodies are searched for acquaintances and life partners.
Then the next question. What is family life like among you? Pleiaren, the upbringing of children, the organization of leisure time, and the coexistence of parents, children, and young and old. This question is also connected with how the education of children and young people is organized, whether there are schools like ours on Earth, what subjects are taught and learned, as well as what interests the children, young people, and adults have.
In this respect, everything is given in a reasonable and correct framework. For the unalterable rule is that with us Pleiaren in every family, everything is maintained in a family-conscious, peaceful, and correct manner. Consequently, there are not the same vicious scenes, gay vault and quarrels which often end with physical harm or even with murder and manslaughter, as is very often and increasingly the case throughout the Earth. Our entire Plei-Aran population is trained from infancy in such a way that peace and freedom and equality between the sexes and between the offspring must be cultivated, and indeed they prevail in this way in every family. Of course, it is also the case in our families that there can be disagreements between parents, just as there can be disagreements between children and parents, although this is not necessarily the rule. But every dispute is avoided, and everything is always kept under control. And this is indeed the case planet-wide, and is observed as it is already taught through education, and is also further taught later in adolescence through special educational courses. The upbringing of children and youth is given in completely peaceful measures, not based on chastisement, but nevertheless strict in order to ensure the best. Necessary recreation for children, youths, and also for adults is also cultivated, whereby the whole is extremely varied, ranging from games to hikes, excursions and factual learning and hobbies, etc. The interests of the individual persons, children, adults, juveniles, are taken into account, which can be extremely varied. And as to the question of the subjects which can be learned, these are, of course, according to our entire stage of development, accessible to every Plei-Aranin and every Plei-Aran, according to their desire and ability, for learning and later practice, these subjects being as great in number as all our developments so far created, whether in regard to medicine, biology, zoology, every possible technique or manual skill, which is also necessary with us, as well as otherwise hundreds of other subjects.
That should actually suffice as an answer. Then, what should actually be a statement and not a question? Namely, how you Plei-Aran observe the events on other planets and whether you are interested in world events, politics, society, art, culture of the Earth, and in how the human beings are on the Earth and deal with their lives. I think that should be obvious, otherwise you would not come here and observe and analyze everything. And as you observe what is happening on other planets, I think you do that equally as you do here on Earth, in that you can control everything through your apparatuses and devices in such a way that nothing remains unseen to you.
So the whole thing needs no further answer or explanation.
Exactly. What does a daily routine of a human being on Era look like? A child, a teenager, a woman, or a man?
During the first years of their upbringing, children are naturally with their parents, in whose care they can learn on the one hand, and on the other hand also play and do all kinds of things that bring them joy, but are also instructive. From the age of 5, children are taught in schools in a variety of ways, while from the age of 14, young people learn specialist subjects, professions in an earthly sense, which continues until the age of 70, although there are also leisure times and 2 hours of work every day. Women and men also have to fulfill the obligation of 2 hours of work daily for the whole community, after which all the other time of the day is used at their own discretion and their own leisure time. All Plei-Aran people have their own small plots of land and a dwelling on them, the plots of land being cultivated as gardens with vegetable crops, etc. Also, very often people fly overland to get in contact with known or foreign people somewhere on the planet and possibly to work together. Women and men also do work together in their homes, where of course there is also cooking, cleaning, and maintenance work.
I know. Further this question. Do all Plei-Aran and the human beings of their federation undertake journeys through space? And what are the requirements for this? And for what purpose do such journeys and missions serve?
Neither among us Plei-Aran nor among our federates is there space tourism, for the populations only undertake journeys through space when there is an urgent need to do so. Space flights to other planets, etc., are only undertaken for economic trading purposes and the like. and for missionary purposes, and for assistance to Plecharan foreign planets and their populations, as well as for exploration and reconnaissance purposes.
Contact Report 698.
That is correct. And I have to explain that the Earth foreigners you mentioned, or their early ancestors, were already present and active here on Earth in prehistoric times, as they were afterwards, but also again and again throughout all the ages of the Earth, throughout all the ages and epochs of the world. The various epochs and each era of the ancient history of the planet are to be reckoned in millions of years, during which the Earth foreigners came to Earth again and again, whereby, however, as Ptah has already explained to you several times, as he mentioned, we have not been able to fathom their effective origin until the present time, whereby we have, however, been able to discover that even these Earth foreigners no longer know their own prehistoric origin. Our research so far has only revealed that their prehistoric ancestors came into the Dern universe from another space-time structure or from another dimension, unknown to us so far, and then also reached Earth and other SOL system planets. But as far as the origin of the distant and present-day Earth foreigners, and thus very distant descendants of those who came to Earth again and again in prehistoric times and also afterwards is concerned, their most distant descendants also come here to this day, whereby they also have stations on Earth. As far as their present origin is concerned, we are very well aware of their present world of origin and the system, although we have no need whatsoever, and our directives also forbid us to make ourselves noticeable and recognizable to them, or even to make contact with them.
Contact Report 699 question. Concerns landing of extraterrestrial intelligences. Billy answer. A public landing of extraterrestrials at the beginning of the 21st century, whereby the appearance of the extraterrestrials was announced in the contact reports. But their nature and origin and also the exact time were only mentioned unofficially. Was planned for the 10th year of the new millennium, should not have taken place by the consciousness-advanced Plecharan, but by Plecharan federates called up on call for preparation and standing by. This, in addition to other extraterrestrials who were to come openly to Earth, of which there was already talk earlier during contact conversations, but which was prevented by interventions of the Plecharan because the hostile and warlike developments of the human beings were too dangerous to Earth, which they still are, and will also be far into the future. The aliens who were to land openly on Earth at the beginning of the third millennium, namely in the USA, would not have been the Plecharan themselves, but members of the Plecharan Federation. This is because they have a simpler and more simple development of consciousness than the Plecharan themselves. Which means that they, in contrast to the Plecharan, could have easily entered the direct sphere of the human beings of Earth in order to communicate and work with them. The whole thing was to be done by first contacting the U.S. government through me, Billy, and through an American intermediary, Ali J. Elders. See Contact Report 117 and Contact Report 122. On the condition and precondition that the USA would have responded to a request from the Plecharan corresponding to the aforementioned matter in the early 1980s. This was to be done, as explained, through the mediation of my personality, in order to submit political and world peace-promoting guidelines and advice etc. to the USA through the Plecharan. These should have been considered by the state leaders of the United States of America, and their results implemented peacefully in the countries dependent on and under the control of the USA all over the world, in order to create effective peace and real freedom for all peoples worldwide. If at that time the state powers of the USA in their megalomania had not reacted with nonsensical, and for the Plecharan unfulfillable primitive stupid demands. When my U.S. middleman submitted the Plecharan request to the U.S. government, Then in case of success, also the then still existing Soviet Union, and also China, Switzerland as well as the then incipient EU dictatorship would have been included. In this way, a worldwide process of peace and freedom and the abolition of dictatorships, as well as the establishment of fully democratic government structures, would have begun under the advisory supervision of the Pleeren and through the work of their federates. Furthermore, through ongoing Pleeren advisory assistance, the whole would certainly have become a state of peace and freedom encompassing the world and all earthly states within 2.5 decades. Which would also have led to the power of determination of the peoples in political and military matters, and to the end of all acts of hostility to war on earth. This would have created the basic prerequisite for a public landing of a delegation of peaceable Pleeren federates, for whom it was decided and determined that they would have had to assist earthly humanity with advice and action in every conceivable good and positive way. However, since the state leaders of the USA, in their delusions of grandeur with regard to their insane, pathologically stupid, nonsensical, confused, self-important and power-driven demands, ruined everything from the outset and condemned it to failure, the plan of the Pleeren to make an attempt to establish contact with the authoritative earthly governments was shelved again. However, it was left open to them, and they waited a whole 20 years to see whether those who were active at the time, or those who followed them in the USA, would come to their senses and respond in the affirmative. But this was not the case. As a result, the whole program of the attempt to establish contact was finally discarded, and the Pleeren closed everything down and declared unofficially that no further attempt of this kind would be made, and that they would therefore also not declare themselves ready for a second attempt, even if the US government should still come forward today or in the future. Contact Report 705.
With us on Era, news is also spread, as is the case on Earth, whereby of course it is also pointed out what is happening on Earth in all ways. The same information is also spread among our federates, so what is happening on Earth is known far and wide in the universe.
Contact Report 710.
With this, I can say that the Earth foreigners, who are generally simply called extraterrestrials or aliens by the Earthlings, have in fact been around for a long time. They stayed here and worked in many ways, as did their distant descendants, but they have also been active on Earth for centuries and millennia up to the present day, flying around and in and out of the Earth, and are observed again and again around the world by the Earthlings, whereby the American continent is of particular importance in this respect. Their early ancestors worked in many different ways on Earth, and also in various countries in Asia, North Africa, and partly in Europe, but mainly in the early days in the North African country, which in later times was called Kemet, and then finally in later times Egypt, after which this name has been preserved until today. Your father Svath taught me during a leap in time into the past to the land there, where the Earth foreigners ruled at that time, whom he called Long Skulls, and whom I have seen myself, that they had been on Earth for thousands of years. Because, in contrast to the round skulls of the human beings of Earth, they had skulls that were long and thickly protruding towards the back. They stood out unmistakably from the human beings of Earth, just as other Earth foreigners did around the world, such as giants up to about 3 meters tall, half-small people with large and somewhat V-shaped heads, and excessively large eyes. Various such long skulls have also been found in modern times by archaeologists, etc., although to this day people still puzzle over what secret is connected with these skulls, which were not from human beings of the Earth, but belonged to Earth aliens. But now I will bring up something from your history that your father Svath has already told me about. Namely that you Plearen on Era and on other planets have been at peace among all peoples for about 52,000 years, only because something strange has happened. At that time, I remember Svath's explanation. A round structure or a large metallic sphere appeared above Era and other Plearen planets, after which all male and female inhabitants of all planets, so to speak, experienced a comprehensive change of heart. Neither at that time nor to this day, however, could you Plearen fathom what this sphere was about, nor where it had come from and where it had disappeared to. Only one thing was clear, namely that through this sphere, some process of consciousness took place in all human beings of all Plearen planets, which immediately led to an all-embracing peace, as well as to freedom from strife, war, crime, and so on. And as Svath explained, as you also once did years ago, you never found out where this orb came from, who built it, and where it disappeared to. Consequently, it was only clear to you that it was through this that your peoples came to peace, and all that has distinguished you Plearen as true human beings for 52,000 years.
What had to be explained in this respect? You have now done, but I must mention that up to now, despite a great deal of research, we have not been able to gain any knowledge about the origin of the sphere, which was completely untouchable and secured against all attacks and therefore also indestructible because it resisted all attempts at attack, which was a good thing in the end. This large spherical missile, which according to our annals had a size that I have calculated to be 248 meters according to the earthly system of measurements, circled around each Plearen planet for 32 days and nights, and then disappeared without a trace. Since then, all the corresponding efforts to clarify the matter, which still continue today, have not been successful, which is why we also have no knowledge of what kind of technology the flying objects had, through which all our peoples were pacified. Note: see also contact reports 711, 47+, and 728.179 to 182 for further information about this orb.
Contact Report 711.
I must begin by addressing what occurred on Era and our other Plearen planets some 52,000 years ago. At that time, swinging waves were emitted from the flying sphere, which circled around Era and also around the other Plearen planets for 32 days each, which took control of a certain brain region and a precisely defined area in all planet inhabitants against which there was no possibility of defense, as could be fathomed by our scientists at that time. However, I may explain, which I will do only briefly and without elaboration, what happened to our ancestors 52,000 years ago, but I really do not intend to go into detail. It turned out that the swinging wave impulses emitted by the aforementioned spherical flying machine very effectively influenced certain areas of the brain of all the planet's inhabitants and had such an effect on special areas that all impulses of violence and degeneracy were appeased, but not extinguished, only put into a softened state and made peaceful. This was sufficient for the populations of all the planets to fall away from all malignant violence and become in a peaceful mood within the time during which the spherical flying machine circled the worlds. But nevertheless they retained their free will and, above all, without external verbal influences from the state leaders and their unpeaceful propaganda, etc., they became more and more inclined to rationality and intellect, and began to think, consider, decide, and act independently. The calming, swinging wave influences, which acted only on certain areas of the brain and in these only on special areas, were neither aggressive nor compelling, for there were only vibratory impulses through which understanding and reason were stimulated and led to the populations discarding their collective world of thought within a few days. because they became free from all the unpeaceful, suggestive, collective thinking controlled by the governments and religions, and were able to form their own independent thoughts and opinions. By very quickly discarding their collective thinking controlled by governments and religions, and also very quickly learning and using their own individual thoughts, the human beings of the Pleiaren planets learned and grasped their personal self-knowledge and formed their own and ever-increasing self-determination, through which they attained personal mental strength. In a special way, the dropping and abandonment of all religious belief factors, and thus the perception and realization of the natural creational laws, which are universally oriented towards peacefulness, freedom, and self-reliance, had an effect. When this was recognized by all Pleiaren populations of all our worlds, and every religious belief was discarded and frowned upon, manifold realizations were formed, and from them the result of personal attitudes and far-reaching thought processes and certainties, which led to all human beings of all peoples setting themselves independently challenging goals and sticking to them even under difficulties, learning to cope with failures better and well, working out a higher motivation and achieving their set self-realization goals. It was also found that within only 11 days, they were less and less distracted by the opinions of other persons, and above all, also no longer allowed themselves to be distracted by the suggestive, unpeaceful whispers of the government, nor allowed themselves to fall back into unpeacefulness. On the contrary, all the populations of all the planets henceforth made all the necessary efforts and perseverance to achieve their goals. Very quickly they became aware of their own abilities, and just as quickly learned to control and master situations of all kinds that arose and quickly became mentally strong persons who also learned to make use of their abilities by constantly seeking and finding new challenges for their intellect and reason, as well as for their self-development and self-realization, and by realizing them as well as themselves. Thus, within a very short time, the individual human beings learned to cope with stress and strain and to live in control of all their self-created personality traits. Through their steadily growing mental strength, they very quickly created a consciousness-like capacity that also had a strong effect on their mental and physical health, as well as on the fact that they were always setting themselves new, challenging goals and realizing them. And all this, together with many other positive developments, finally led within only 32 days, during which the orbital aircraft circled the worlds, to all persons, of all populations finally freeing themselves independently and according to their own free will from all Außertungen, getting very badly out of control of their good human natures, and from all violence and immorality, etc., through the unimaginably strong, swinging wave impulses of evolutionary effect, which were emitted by the flying sphere and influenced the personalities of all our Pleiaren planets. All human beings became aware within a very short time that they were being influenced externally by other persons, forces and populist and unpeaceful government-controlled influences which were hostile to peace, degenerate, inciting violence and destructive, as well as impairing the intellect and reason, negative and malignant, and were influencing them negatively against their own will and causing them to lapse into violence, etc. This realization led the human beings of all our planets to renounce violence, immorality, degeneracy, evil, and wickedness, and also to conquer their bad habits. It was also recognized, however, that in spite of all knowledge and efforts with regard to the conduct of life in the good, the correct, the human, and with regard to righteousness, as well as with regard to the observance of the natural positive creative laws, the human being always remains susceptible and can fall back again into old, ungood, negative, evil, and bad behavior, if he does not make the necessary effort to control it in order to prevent it. And it has been recognized that this can always happen again if the human beings are influenced from the outside in any verbal, physical, or consciousness, thought, emotion, and psyche, burdening forms for long enough. So in this respect, all human beings of all Pleiaren planets, or their populations, were subordinated to this natural creative law of action in such a way that countermeasures had to be taken, which were recorded and followed in directives, and which consisted in the fact that no direct or otherwise harmful connections were to be sought and maintained with alien worlds and their populations, in order not to relapse into the old modes of behavior through such contacts with alien peoples who were not like our ancestors. We Pleiaren of today are also human beings, like our ancestors 52,000 years ago, and all our descendants since then, who must resist such external influences without being harmed. For unfortunately, we are still susceptible to negative, external influences that would cause us to relapse into the old ways of behavior if we were to fall long enough into areas of negative influence that were harmful to us and were hit by factors that had a negative effect on us. We Pleiaren, too, are human beings and are ordered to develop within the framework of every natural creational order and lawfulness, through a very laborious working out of our higher evolution of consciousness, which even after 52,000 years of peace, we must follow and continue to learn. And this we can do today through the life teaching of Nakademion, the teaching of truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of life, which helps us unspeakably much in our further evolution of consciousness, but which was known to us only in small parts up to the beginning of your mission, but which you now bring and teach not only to Earth humans, but also to us, in many expanded versions. But as far as our ancestors were concerned, more than 52,000 years ago, they only gained their knowledge at that time, and only then became aware of the effective facts and values of life according to the natural creative laws. When the flying sphere appeared and circled around our Pleiaren planets, whereby all Pleiaren populations were struck by its vibratory impulses and were appeased and peacefully tuned in a restrained, yet definite and effective manner. Through these vibratory impulses, their minds and reason were stimulated, whereby the populations turned to the gently urging peaceful impulses and gave themselves consciously learning to their evolution of consciousness. Through this attention, our ancestors of that time recognized the truth and effectiveness of the natural creative laws and correct natural creative conditioned way of life, learned to fathom them and to follow them and made them their own, whereby henceforth all populations consciously developed according to them and aligned themselves to them in every way. But they were able to do all this only after they realized that their entire very high technical development in all its forms and possibilities did not turn them away from their degenerations, their violent behavior, and from all evil, from all warfare and all destructive and negative and evil behavior with regard to peace, real freedom, righteousness, justice, and humanity, as well as a way of life according to natural creative laws. Only through the influence of the vibrational impulses, which were emitted by the spherical flying device and by which they were peacefully influenced, did they find their way to personal change. And finally, through their own development of consciousness, cognition and their efforts, their own will, their intellect, their reason, and the use of their intelligence, they attained their personal inner peace, their personal inner freedom and righteousness. And this inestimable gain and victory over themselves they also began to bring to bear externally, whereby all peoples also allied themselves among themselves in a continuing state of peace and freedom. And since then, all violence, degenerations and wars, etc., have also become a thing of the past. However, it must be repeated as a fact that all violence, Wars, all hatred and falsehood, all discord, all unfreedom and unrighteousness, as well as all injustice and degeneracy, etc., in all forms, could only be ended. In all forms could only be brought to an end when the vibratory impulses of the orb had an effect upon all the Pleiaren peoples and soothed them into peace, whereby they became consciously powerful of their own independent and externally uninfluenced faculty of thought, as well as of their intellect, their reason, and the application of their intelligentsia, and thereby their own self-evolution could take place. This did not mean, however, that our ancestors 52,000 years ago, or since, were above any susceptibility to and reversion to the old degenerate, malignant, warlike, violent, and all other negative forms, and disregarding all natural creative laws. And this is not the case even in modern times, for even we Pleiaren of today are not immune to this, just as all our ancestors were not. The negative factors mentioned, as they are drastically present in Earth humans, also occur in the third grouping as well as in the Earth future beings, who on the one hand have already been on Earth for thousands of years or otherwise for a considerable time, again and again demonstrating their presence in various ways.
But it must be clear that in the vastness of the universe, there are also other human beings and life forms who are equally sick in the head, and live with degenerations of all kinds, unpeaceful and unrighteous, and therefore also make their existence hell by their own doing, in a similar or the same way as the Earthlings. And as Svath has already said, it can be said that the absolute majority of all human and human-like creatures in our entire Dern universe have, through their own early degenerations, fallen into a convergent state with that of degenerated Earth humans. This, however, can one day lead to enormous unpleasantness and even to acts of war with extraterrestrials and to the danger of the extermination or enslavement of Earth humans, as well as to the annexation of Earth by Earth foreigners. And it is precisely in this respect that crazy Earth foreigners, who do not possess reason, rationality, and intelligence for a penny, have done everything with the SETI project so that it can happen under certain circumstances if Earth foreigners find the SETI probe. Through this crazy project, extraterrestrials are to be made aware of Earth, and contact is to be sought with them.
Contact Report 713.
This, however, can one day become a risky doom for Earth humans, namely through the stupidity and irresponsibility committed by earthly researchers and scientists, namely with the SETI project Cyclops, or Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And such a fate can befall all Earth humans if official contact with unpeaceful Earth foreigners should one day occur. An attempt at contact which was started unreasonably and recklessly by the search for extraterrestrials, and which under certain circumstances can bring not only great horrors, etc., but ultimately also a nasty end to all Earth human existence.
Contact Report 717.
But what I wanted to say when you interrupted me was simply this: whose presence on Earth has been based since time immemorial on behaving according to certain guidelines that also give them security and protection. I did not want to say more, for their existence could also be endangered if the real truth about them, their doings, their ways, as well as their origin and whereabouts, etc., were known. But this must not happen. Earth foreigners are also beings whose right to exist and live must be granted and assured to them, but which would be endangered if certain facts about them became known. But this also applies to the earthly grouping, which also makes itself felt here and there.
Contact Report 718.
Also good. Then the following question is whether you guys influence planetary weather on Era, like maybe through lightning control and cloud formation by lasers or something, if that is even possible. Also, the further question is related to whether you have a poison industry to produce any substances, like herbicides, insecticides, neonicotinoids, pesticides, and fungicides, and so on.
Weather manipulation in the context of your question is possible, but we do not carry out such manipulations on Era. The climate conditions of our planet are normal and are not influenced by our humanity in any way. Regarding your other question, it is to be said that we do not have any production facilities on Era where any toxic substances would be produced, so also not such as you mentioned.
Contact Report 719.
Now that we're on the subject, I can also combine it with something else, namely with makeup, which is common here on Earth for women and also for men. Although I have also seen you on Era, as well as all the women who come to me from you, that you take care of yourself cosmetically. But I have never seen that you look effective in the same or a similar way as the Earthling women would paint on their faces. By that I mean the areas around the eyes, the cheeks and lips, as well as the draping of the lips, the tongue, the nose, the pubic area, breasts, and other pieces of jewelry embedded in the body, some of which are young people, but many women and men do. In and of itself, I don't care at all, because that's everyone's own thing and therefore none of my business. But I have something to mock, namely, that I find the smearing on the lips extremely disgusting, and the whole thing also disfiguring. I have nothing against a light, subtle, and hardly or not at all visible lip care, just as I have no objections to a subtle skin, that is to say, facial and eye care, as I know it from your Plejar-Yan women and as sensible women do with us. But I find a woman messing up her face in a painted war landscape just gross. In addition, the ostentatious lip-painted women are repulsive and look like disfigured circus clowns, who are still original in a certain way. But this does not apply to these women, but who, with their lip painting, look more like a worn-out deep-sea frigate, and also act accordingly. What is your opinion on this, my friend?
I can understand what you are saying, and I would like to say that after listening to you, I am kind of glad that in our world as a whole, all women take care of themselves with the kind of discreet cosmetic care that you mentioned. For my part, I also cannot find any pleasure in what female beings do in the way you have described.
Contact Report 721.
The beginning of the spirit form of Nocademion on Earth came about 389,000 years ago, when a Plejaren herald from the Nocademion lineage named Ijum, meaning of the name the Prudent One, came to Earth with 144,000 human beings from the Nocademian people and settled in the Gobi Desert. However, the teaching that Ijum taught was disregarded, as has been the case since time immemorial and always, which is why there were always only a few who opened their ears to the efforts of the Annunciator. The majority of the masses, therefore, did not care for the teaching brought by the herald, but in their delusion of faith, continued to follow their gods, which equally led to differences and disputes among the various faith groups, as has always been the case, even in later times, and has remained so to this day among all the delusional believers in religion on Earth. At that time, however, after only a short time, the hostilities among the immigrants broke out to such an extent that the city built in the desert and the other populated areas, as well as the Earth, had to be abandoned. More than 25,000 years ago, new Plejaren immigrants arrived on Earth with a slightly yellowish skin pigmentation and mixed with already existing earthly human forms, resulting in another human species that migrated to a large island. The original immigrants, who came from our Ankar universe more than 25,000 years ago, had created a dimensional gateway millions of light years beyond the Milky Way galaxy, and so entered the Dern universe, and from there to Earth, where they settled in fertile areas that are now all part of China. What happened about 389,000 years ago, after only a third of a century, then quickly led to the termination of the action and the abandonment of Earth, after which their distant descendants many generations later, about 13,500 years ago, once again formed an Earth immigrant community and came to Earth. These settled east and south in various places in the areas bordering the Mediterranean Sea and sought a new beginning. This, then, was after another ancient Pleiadian emigrant community had migrated and settled in the fertile lands of what is now called China, some 11,500 years earlier. When then about 13,500 years ago the up-to-then last Pleiadian community of immigrants came to Earth, then this happened in a completely secret form. Namely because since the time of 389,000 years earlier, other extraterrestrials had come to the Earth in the meantime and had settled down far and wide on all continents, above all the long-skulled ones. In ancient Egypt in particular, they rose to positions of power, waged wars and subjugated tribes of peoples, such as those who called themselves Ebraya. It was these who, in later times, under the leadership of a Negrid Pleiadian descendant called Avian, note meaning of name, he who gives refuge, who was, however, called Avram by the Ebraya, had joined forces, about 4,500 years ago with the still few distant descendants of the ancient Pleiadian immigrants who appeared about 13,500 years ago and also begat many descendants. From these descendants begotten between Pleiadian descendants and the Ebraya, a sixfold lineage of termination then emerged, namely from the reincarnation line of Nocodemion, whose spirit form reincarnated several times and in rapid succession among the Ebraya. This was after the then messenger Ijum from the Nocodemion line lost his life in the Gobi Desert during the warfare of the Earth immigrant community about 385,000 years ago, and his spirit form either remained in the earthly realm or migrated and returned, about which unfortunately nothing is known in detail. What is known to us, however, is that the old Pleiadian immigrants very quickly mixed with the above-mentioned tribes of peoples. But it turned out that this time, two unpleasant disputes arose, which led to the fact that, despite the efforts of the heralds, various of these peoples split up and partly also fell into bondage to other peoples. However, when I speak of those peoples into which the Pleiadian immigrants integrated themselves, I am not referring to large peoples, but to larger tribes of peoples that did not correspond to complex forms of social organization. The members of these tribes of peoples, which corresponded to a tribal ethnicity, traced back to a common ancestry, which ensured that a certain mutual cohesion was given as a result of kinship. This, however, did not prevent larger national peoples, who could no longer be called tribes of peoples, but real great peoples or state peoples, from forcibly binding smaller tribes of peoples into servitude. This was also partly the case with the tribes of peoples who had settled around the Mediterranean areas and had mixed with the Pleiadian immigrants at an early stage, who were then forced into servitude in the land of the ruling long-sufferers. But the same thing happened to the Ebraya not only by the rulers in ancient Egypt, but also to their distant descendants by the king of the new Babylonian Empire, Nabuchodonosor, who is also called Nebuchadnezzar II. The proto-tribal leader of the Ebraya was a very distant Negrid descendant of a Pleiadian group who had appeared on Earth as immigrants more than 13,500 years ago, who had also mixed with Earth humans. This proto-tribal leader called Avian, living in a land area called Plekt, east of the Mediterranean, with a nomadic tribe of Ebraya who called him Avram. The denunciation by 6 heralds with the Nocodemian spirit form took place after the Pleiadian immigration on Earth some 13,500 years ago and lasted until the time of the year 632. The heralds were the following: Enoch, born 3rd of February 930, 894 before Emmanuel. BC. Eliah, born 5th February 891, 780 before Emmanuel. BC. Yasaja, born 7th February 7722, 690 before Emmanuel. BC. Jeremiah, born 9th February 662, 580 before Emmanuel. BC. Emmanuel, born 3rd February 2111, 9th May Muhammad. Born 19th of the February 571 to 632 after Emmanuel AD, they all endeavored to teach the doctrine of Nacademion not only among the Ebraya, but also among various peoples who existed in the regions bordering the Mediterranean to the east and south, as well as in Egypt and on both sides of the Red Sea down to its end. But they also taught far eastward to Mesopotamia, where King Gilgamesh formerly ruled in Uruk-Gart, as well as to the Aryan country. What I still want to explain for today, this refers to the fact that also in the sister creation, the teachings in the Dal universe are taught among the peoples who have migrated from our planets, so also among the people of Ishrish-Asket, as also among all Sonair peoples. And the fact that we also brought this teaching to Earth at an early time was due to the fact that our ancestors discovered a natural dimensional gate 22 million years ago by chance, which is located here in the Dern universe about 120 light-years beyond the Pleiades stars known to you. The dimensional gateway was discovered because a moon from our Ankar universe that had drifted from an exploded planet entered the Dern universe through this dimensional gateway, which our ancestors investigated and then found to be Earth's satellite. One consequence of this was that over the course of millions of years, small groups of Pleiaren repeatedly migrated to Earth and also died here. Later, when the first human life forms also developed on Earth around 12 million years ago in various areas that are now Europe, Africa, Asia, North and South America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China and Russia, as well as various islands, several small groups of our Pleiaren ancestors had also already settled in some areas on the planet, but they all died out in the course of the next millions of years. About 6 million years ago, when the distant descendants of the first human beings moved in a few specimens all over the Earth and had developed more highly over the next 3 million years, more Pleiaren emigrants came to Earth, some of whom joined forces with the original earthly humans and mated with them.
The norms established by Nacademion with regard to morals, ethics, ethos, etc. became valid for every single life form up to the great mass of all human life forms, whereby the only prerequisite for their use and implementation was to possess a clear consciousness as well as understanding, reason, and a functioning intellect in order to be able to make the norms of behavior valid. All the conventions created by Nacademion in primeval times and brought to Earth in the course of time and forgotten were, however, brought here again by early Pleiaren sometime before antiquity, when other Earth foreigners were also coming and going and had already spread all over the world. Even from these, however, the early Pleiaren kept themselves secret for millions of years, so as not to provoke interplanetary conflicts, and also not to let such excesses break into their dimension. So they also held back from the Earth foreigners who ruled in various pre-ancient countries on Earth, such as the Long Skulls, who exercised their might especially in the areas around the Nile and in the southland of the American continent.
Contact Report 724.
The existence of the many kinds of aliens who have been working on Earth since time immemorial, about which you also have much better knowledge than we do.
Contact Report 725.
This is known to me from our very numerous war records, which have been made by us during all wars and other weapons engagements on Earth since time immemorial, which are broadcast to all our worlds and Federation members as information, which has a general deterrent effect with regard to acts of war and terrorism.
Contact Report 743.
Any person with Swiss citizenship who is of a different mind and violates it in such a way as to seek or even advocate membership in a foreign power, as you have stated in the Europe Union dictatorship, then such a person is not worthy of Swiss citizenship and should be immediately deprived of it and excluded from all political rights. This would be done in our country according to our legal system if something similar were to arise, which will never be the case, because neither in our country nor in our entire Federation do any dictatorial systems exist or are any elements that would produce such a nonsensical request. Such a request would be considered a betrayal of our homeland, as well as a betrayal of our peoples, of our Pleiaren and all Federation sentiments, and of our world, according to our legal system and state constitution. Such a person, disloyal and disloyal to the homeland, would, according to the state constitution, be pardonlessly excluded from all political rights of the society.
Contact Report 748.
But while we are at it, perhaps we could spend a few words on how you manage to maintain your motility and remain physically mobile at all times. As many times as I have encountered Pleiaren human beings on Era or elsewhere, I have never been able to observe any who have had physical births.
I also, of course, use our hydrodynamic regeneration converter technology, which ensures that we reach our old age in full mobility.
I know that, because Svath already explained it to me. However, I am interested in something else that I never asked about, namely whether and to what extent you can self-regulate your old age.
Our long lifespan of over 1,000 years corresponds to an uninfluenced natural generative process.
What do I understand by this? A generative process. If I look at generative etymologically and try to classify and define the word value as such in relation to your long lifespan correctly, then it tells me that the whole thing is time-honored and must always have been so. Therefore, when I consider this generative in relation to your long lifetimes, I think that this generative must probably be associated or composed with a natural generating, and probably at the same time with an equally natural regenerative process. I could also use this to define and explain the totality of life support from conception to death. Is it true, or am I right, or have I fallen on my head?
What you think and how you put it all together can be described as correct, because you obviously understand the etymological traditional in this sense as the basic meaning of traditional and the like, not only with regard to a word, but also with regard to other things, such as our age of life.
Contact Report 750.
Aging as a physiological process corresponds to an elementary life process, which is inherent in all higher life forms and represents a biological phenomenon which can be positively influenced and prolonged by the most diverse measures, but whose effectiveness cannot be canceled or terminated. In general, aging is therefore a process of a series of different, highly complex organic processes that influence the entire organism and determine the lifespan of all biological systems, such as cells, consequently also limiting the organs, tissues, and organisms built up from them in terms of time. This process of aging can be influenced and extended by suitable means, although maximum limits are also set in this respect. Consequently, organ regeneration cannot take place endlessly because when a certain state is reached by natural aging of the organs, they become susceptible to aging and fail inexorably. And this brings me to the explanation regarding our age limit, which according to earthly time calculation is not normally given at 1,200 or 1,400 years or more, because our Pleiaren lifespan, calculated according to earthly years, which differs only by a few with our time calculation, amounts to an average of 380 years. Furthermore, with regard to the age and aging of our Pleiaren humanity, it is to be said that many persons do not endeavor to prolong their lives and consequently do not avail themselves of any of the hydrodynamic regeneration converters available to all, but live through their lifetime normally and die just as normally when they have become tired of life. Suicides are absolutely unknown here, as are also diseases. Other persons of our humanity use the regeneration apparatus to live on for a few years, decades, or centuries, especially when very long commitments lasting many centuries are made and exercised. However, it is seldom the case that life beyond 1,500 years is sought, because inevitably, with time, life fatigue or the natural aging process occurs. Consequently, dying then also naturally becomes the end of life.
Contact Report 754.
Then something else. If I remember correctly, on Era you have no political parties whatsoever, as this bullshit exists on Earth. Can you explain to me how you guys manage to run everything world community-wise?
Act 1. We Pleiaren have had no political parties of any kind on Era or on any other of our worlds. As was the case in former times, since the peace came to all our peoples more than 50,000 years ago. Parties of all kinds were then banished extensively from all Pleiaren rules of government, because they led to constant disagreements, as our state chronicles record. Parties always meant that they discussed, negotiated and determined motions and regulations concerning any municipal matters, laws, regulations, ordinances, or other necessities, and that they decreed and implemented them, which, however, did not correspond to the will of the people as a result of disagreements. This was the result of a wide variety of inaccuracies and deliberate falsehoods in election proposals, which were brought about by lying and deceiving the people, because they were not enlightened in accordance with the truth, but were misled with false promises and declarations. 2. Since the abolition of any party system more than 50,000 years ago, our experience and knowledge has shown that since then no disputes, no political differences, no quarrels, no discontent, no quarrels of opinion, no disturbances of the peace, no other inconsistencies in local, regional, or national communities, and no wrong decisions have arisen. Nor have there been any planetary political dangers, uprisings, demonstrations, wars, or terrorism, etc. since then, not even in the slightest way, which, however, was often the case in earlier times, and a general unrest was permanent, as our chronicles show. 3. Our exact and clear knowledge and action concerning the suppression of all political parties, as such still existed in former times more than 50,000 years ago, prove since their legal abolition that in former times, and just when parties still existed, apolitical parties led unrestrictedly and inevitably to differences of opinion, quarrels as well as to violence, discontent and communal political as well as private discord. See, with us Pleiaren, therefore, there has been no party system for more than 50,000 years, but our entire population election determination procedure is geared to our planetary or territorial communal system, respectively, to our planet-wide communalization of electronic transmission in relation to the people's sovereignty as sovereign, who determines the state duties and public tasks for transformation and implementation into action, after which the communal administrative bodies have the duty incumbent upon them to implement the electoral decisions through suitable forces, etc. basically, then it is to be defined by way of repetition and explanation that our entire system of electoral determination is geared to the fact that all the electoral facts that arise and have to be dealt with, which originate on the one hand from the peoples and on the other hand from the state bodies, are discussed, negotiated, explained, defined, and decided upon in a thorough, detailed, and comprehensible manner in question-answer mode over the entire planetary expanse by means of remote communication with the populations. All facts arising and put to the vote will be made, known to the populations of an arising territorial or the whole Pleiadian area 30 days before the election determination date via the corresponding remote communicative areas. After that, the people can take part in the electoral process of their own free will at the corresponding time, which will be conducted in detail over a whole day, during which everything that has to do with the election will be openly discussed and clarified in a question and answer procedure, and finally the election will be decided. D. Finally, it is to be explained that our committee, which is known to you, like all the persons who assemble in the Great Pyramid Hall, as you call our great assembly place, determine at consultative meetings which facts arise that are to be brought before the people for the determination of the election. As you know, there are about 1.5 million persons present in the Pyramid Hall, who are composed of all classes of the population and who fulfill this task according to their own free will, and consequently correspond not to certain, but to voluntary deputies of the population, who declare themselves willing to do so, and who are also composed of other persons at each deliberative meeting. The persons who designate themselves as deputies also voluntarily change among themselves during the sessions, so that several persons can give their opinion on a single matter. When, at the end of the deliberations, everything has been discussed and clarified in detail and beyond doubt, which may take several days, then the final act takes place, in which, as a rule, there is unanimity in favor of an electoral provision, which is then presented in the manner mentioned to the people for their electoral determination.
How is it actually with you on Era and on all other planets? Do the human beings of the Pleiaren have any private lethal weapons at all? And what about militaries, armies, and security forces, etc., regarding lethal weapons, etc.?
As far as your direct question concerning weapons among the Pleiaren is concerned, that is to say, whether the Pleiaren privately possess weapons, I can explain that this is not the case, just as we do not have any weapons of war, nor do we have any instruments, etc., that are designed to kill human beings. We are only equipped with effective defense instruments that are manufactured in such a way that they cannot be used to kill, but only to temporarily disable human beings or other living beings of all kinds and species, without these being in any way impaired in terms of health or even bodily organic damage.
But that is not what I want to ask, but whether demonstrations are also known at all among you on Era, or among you Pleiaren.
In our entire Pleiaren planetary realms, demonstrations such as are carried out on Earth are absolutely unknown, because no justifications whatsoever arise that could lead to such behavior. As you know, all the concerns of each and every person are profoundly settled by our board, which presides, together with some 1.5 million voluntary representatives of the people and in the presence of the person of concern, and consequently, nothing is ever left unresolved. As a result, in such discussions, clarifications, determinations, and negotiations, nothing arises that cannot be clarified to the satisfaction of the person concerned, group of persons, or a community of people, etc., if such negotiations and etc. have to be clarified to the satisfaction of an individual person, a community, or a population by all those participating in them.
I know that and have already experienced it together with your father Svath. I also know that such an event happens only very rarely and just hardly ever.
That is correct.
Contact Report 763.
Ptah is far away on a Federation planet called Orban, where a lengthy federal conference is being held.
Contact Report 766.
Earlier, I started to ask something about the first and following journeys of the Pleiaren, first 25 million years ago. As I know, contacts with Earthlings were made again and again, but never on a large scale, but only with individual human beings, and usually only with captains of small groups or larger tribes, as well as with sages and clever inventors. There were also other Earth foreigners on Earth with whom the Pleiaren never had any contact, among them also the long-skinned and the giants, who lived especially in Egypt, South America, and Asia. But there were also the small-bodied extraterrestrials, whose distant descendants still live in Asia today, but who hide from the so-called civilized and can only rarely be observed. On the other hand, a small group of small aliens had settled around Lake Sonura, which existed here in the Purg region about 20 or 30 million years ago before it disappeared. I would like to ask you to what extent you are aware of your earlier emigration history with regard to migrations or other longer or shorter stays on foreign worlds, whereby I am asking specifically with regard to Earth.
I can't give more details on that because in that regard, I have never dealt with it much, but only to the extent that I have some limited knowledge of self-orientation.
But perhaps your knowledge is sufficient to enable you to tell me to what extent the early Pleiaren interfered on a large scale with Earthling cultures here on Earth.
I can comment on this, for I know from the historiography of our early emigrants who came to Earth that there was no direct interference in cultural or otherwise profound matters on Earth. No groupings of our ancestors saw fit to do so, nor have they to this day, except for one attempt, see Contact Reports 117 and 122, which we sought to test through you, but which did not materialize as a result of the megalomania of those responsible for it in the USA, but which we had assumed beforehand, and without foresight, to be so.
So there were never any overt or covert contacts with governments, any peoples or major organizations, etc. That is clear now. But what about contacts with you alien extraterrestrials here on Earth?
There are also no records in the relevant historiography that would point to such occurrences. Consequently, no such contacts have taken place, and indeed, not up to the present hour. We of the present time also have to refrain from such contacts and to do all we can to avoid being noticed by aliens, which is what our directives tell us to do in this regard, and for good reason, as you and Onkoton have already discussed. Onkoton. To search for other life forms in distant regions of the galaxy or in alien galaxies involves very great dangers, for very many alien life forms of various kinds are not only aggressive, but malignant. And when such beings get to alien worlds that offer life possibilities for them, they conquer them and exterminate all life that could be dangerous to them.
Contact Report 770.
Excuse me, you mean that you Pleiaren also learn and study music and all the trimmings?
Of course, and Bermunda is a renowned virtuoso on Era and is proficient on several harmony instruments.
Excuse me, what do you mean by persons who are very strictly involved with music? Do you mean professional musicians like the ones we have on Earth who earn their living with music? If so, then the question, do you also have such musicians?
I suppose you call these persons so. Yes, that is the meaning of my explanation. And yes, we also cultivate music in this wise and conduct studies of musical teaching. And that I can explain everything to you for your understanding, that I am able to do, because through my musical education I am equally well versed in the fundamentals and forms of music, as well as in the theory of composition, and also in the measures in time and notation, as well as in the naming of notes, rhythm, keys, and tone levels, etc.
How many languages do you actually have on Era?
We have several languages, but only one that is common to all, and that each person is completely fluent in.
Then every person can communicate with every other person, wherever they meet.
Yes.
Then I have the question about prostitution, fornication. I was asked how you on Era do it. Do you also have brothels or something like that?
We do not know of such things. Our directives also do not contain any such records, because basically everything in this respect is frowned upon and regulated among our peoples before it comes to emergency situations. We have regulated everything in this respect in such a manner that androids are available to regulate all private needs in this respect, on a truly private basis, without any public prostitution taking place. Thus, everything is regulated privately, in such a way in female and also in male respect. Consequently, female as well as male androids are available, but never human beings who would give themselves to this activity. Of course, partnerships of this kind exist between two human beings, but as such, they are firm unions, and consequently, no prostitution is practiced in this relationship either.
Contact Report 781.
As a rule, not all alien beings from foreign celestial regions or from foreign worlds of foreign celestial bodies are peaceful-minded. Peacefulness is in no way common among life forms in any universe, for peacefulness requires a socially balanced evolution, which unfortunately is not very common. Our Federation, which is spread over several universes of two creations and covers so many light years in earthly terms that they cannot be put into usual words, is quite peaceful, but outside the Federation community everything is of a different nature. But let us return to our peoples on Era, as well as to our other 5 worlds that exist in our vast double solar system, some of which are also known to you. They all have the same systems of governance, so there are no differences whatsoever from one Pleiaren planet to another, for each and everything is uniformly the same in governance, in the treatment of the rights of the peoples, as well as in their developments and everything else. So there are no differences whatsoever. This is also the case with regard to gender, that is to say female or male, as well as children, activities and abilities, etc., so that there are no special positions among us, not even with regard to the fact that a human being is valued more or less because of his achievements or his office, or enjoys more or less prestige, or would attract special attention as a prominent person. The fact that human beings make themselves great and go public because they want to present themselves in their wrong thinking and wrong feeling does not exist here.
So there is no publicity lust, as we call it. There is no such thing with you guys. I already know that since the time with Svath.
No, that would also be frowned upon from the ground up. We are all equal as human beings. Consequently, we never do anything to make ourselves look, behave, attract special attention, or value ourselves more than any other.
Svath said respectively, a human being who puts himself in the foreground and thinks himself special is not only selfish, but always looking out for himself in every way, not honest, devious, and will go over dead bodies if it is necessary for him.
That's how it's taught with us and how young people are taught, even in their early youth, because according to our ethics, it's not acceptable that one human being, for whatever reason, thinks he's more valuable than another. But if I were to go on about our universally valid systems, if, for example, we receive any knowledge and new achievements from the Sonarn, then these are made available indiscriminately and without conditions to all our peoples, who, by the way, all practice birth control and do not allow their population to rise above the level that could somehow bring harm and destruction, annihilation or extinction to the planet, its atmosphere, climate, ecosystems, or nature and its fauna and flora. Since our planets are of different sizes, etc., They are also inhabited with different numbers of human beings of the total population. So, for example, according to our calculations, Era could support, feed, provide for and maintain about 1.4 billion human beings without any problems, without harming the planet, all ecosystems, and thus nature and its fauna and flora for the duration of several million years. We do not have a military because we do not need one, because all around everything is peaceful, and our peoples of all planets are classified in this peacefulness. So also all our devices and apparatuses of possibly necessary defense do not have any lethal effect on human forms or animals, etc., but in any case they only produce a paralysis which lasts for several hours, but without exception all vital functions are guaranteed and harmless. We may well learn to use such apparatus and appliances, but we do not hold exercises involving the use of such things.
Contact Report 790.
This is actually what I have to say, and what I learned especially from Svath nearly 80 years ago and have never forgotten. He knew a lot more about the human psyche than is peculiar to earthly psychologists who fancy themselves kings of their field, but in reality and truth know very little.
He was really very knowledgeable in this subject, which he also taught on Era, and was a master of it.
Contact Report 791.
I must mention that we have had no murders on Era and our world since time immemorial. This has already occurred after human beings separated from their religious beliefs more than 50,000 years ago and became free from all faith and thus free in themselves and also peaceful. But as far as religious faith is concerned, our faith-captured Pleiadian peoples also had to realize and experience the truth about this over 50,000 years ago. This led to a great many of them ending their own lives. In the course of time, only those remained who began to cultivate their own thoughts, thought out their own decisions, and carried out their own determined actions. And there also remained those who were fickle, and who ultimately chose between religious faith and the reality of reality. Consequently, all religions and every human being, whose faith very quickly became void and extinguished, and the result was that the human beings became peaceful. This became established very quickly, as a result of which the nonsense of all religiosity and religious belief was recognized by the human beings themselves and reduced to absurdity. This gave rise to religion-free peoples who, without any religious belief, have now lived in peace and harmony for more than 50,000 years, because 1. The quarrels between the various religions were resolved, and 2. The human beings learned to think for themselves and also to decide logically, rationally, and reasonably. Consequently, they also learned to act accordingly. This was also learned by the humanities and peoples belonging to our Federation. For our ancestors endeavored to spread their new way of thinking and their new way of life and the necessary understanding of it, which was accepted and realized by all humanities in a short time.
And the great orb at that time that had started all this, was that involved in that also with the Federated?
Yes, that is how it is handed down to us.
Do you also have organ transplantation from one human being to another, or from dead to living on Era or elsewhere?
But no, that is not possible with us, because all the dignity of a human being speaks against such a thing, because the dignity of human beings is inviolable for us. It is respected, protected, and preserved in every way. This is laid down in our directives and obliges all directive order. All our peoples are committed to this, and therefore they will never violate this directive and respect it as a human right, as the basis of all human dignity. This also includes peace and justice with regard to the humans themselves and their lives, whereby their fundamental rights as independent v-sin are also guaranteed and may never be violated. This fundamental right is bound up with the fact that no executive gayvault and jurisdiction may ever be used as a directly applicable right against life and limb and therefore also not against organs, thus opposing the removal of organs, regardless of whether or not there is still life in them.
So in terms of your directives, the meaning is, if I understand the whole thing correctly, that in any case there must be no transplantation of a foreign organ into a body.
That is correct. But there is, if I may explain this in a simple way for the explanation, the possibility of a transplantation in such a way that a correspondingly necessary organ is grown from the body's own substance, if I may say so for the sake of understanding, which can then be transplanted. So our directives explicitly prohibit the transplanting of organs foreign to one's own body, which includes blood as well as other fluids, but which are largely still unknown to earthly medicine for insertion into a living body.
I can still remember this. I still remember that there was talk of the corresponding organs being cultivated beforehand, depending on the possible need, before they have to be used in an emergency.
That is correct. It corresponds to our procedure and practice. However, our directives forbid the removal of any organs from the deceased, because this is not only barbaric and unaesthetic and therefore unacceptable in every respect, but from a purely human point of view, it means nothing other than desecration of the dead, what you call desecration of corpses on earth.
And, well, how did you play and get into the business of growing human organs and transplanting them?
As I know the history of our development in this regard, our path, explained in simple terms, led us to the early recognition of the properties of artificial methods for growing complex organ models from stem cells.